The land office in Caldwell didn't smell like justice. It smelled like pipe tobacco and wet wool, and the particular staleness of men who had been sitting in the same chairs making the same crooked deals for 20 years. Evelyn Mercer stood at the counter with her sister's deed in her hand, folded, worn soft at the creases from how many times she'd unfolded it in the dark, just to remind herself it was real, and watched the clerk look at it the way a man looks at something he's already decided doesn't matter. "This deed is registered in the name of Clara Hartwell," the clerk said. He didn't look up. "Clara Hartwell was my sister. She died in September. The land passes to next of kin." Evelyn set her palm flat on the counter. "That's me." The clerk turned the deed over, examined the back of it, which was blank, set it down and folded his hands over it like it was his now. "There's a filing dispute on that parcel," he said. "Harmon Land and Cattle filed a competing claim 3 weeks ago. Until the dispute resolves, no transfer of title can be processed." Evelyn looked at him. "Harmon Land and Cattle didn't homestead that land. My sister did. She built a cabin on it. She worked it for 4 years. Ma'am, I don't make the law. I process paperwork." "Then process mine." He slid the deed back across the counter to her. "Come back when the dispute resolves." She picked it up. Her hand didn't shake. She'd learned a long time ago not to let her hand shake in front of men like this, because the moment they saw it, they stopped listening to words and started watching for other signs of weakness. She tucked the deed into her coat pocket and walked out into the cold. Outside, the wind hit her like an open hand. She stood on the plank sidewalk and breathed through her nose until the burning behind her eyes went away. Then she looked down the street at the Harmon Land and Cattle office, the name painted in new gold letters on the glass, the kind of gold that meant money spent on appearances. And she understood exactly what had happened. Someone had seen a widow woman's name on a homestead deed and decided that was an opportunity. She had 6 weeks before the winter filing deadline. After that, unoccupied claims defaulted to contesting parties regardless of original homestead rights. 6 weeks to get to Clara's land, establish residency, and file proof of occupancy in person at the territorial office 40 miles past the claim itself. Her wagon was packed. Her mule was stubborn but sound. She had enough provisions for 3 weeks if she was careful, and she intended to be careful. What she didn't tell anyone, what she hadn't told herself out loud yet, was that the cut on her left calf, the one she'd gotten climbing through a broken fence board 2 weeks ago, had not healed the way it should have. She was 4 days out of Caldwell when she first admitted, privately and without saying it aloud even to the mule, that something was wrong. The cut had gone hot. Not the ordinary heat of a healing wound, but a deeper heat, a heat that had moved up into the muscle and was sitting there with a weight she couldn't ignore. She'd cleaned it twice. She'd wrapped it with the last of her good cloth. She'd told herself it was improving because the alternative wasn't something she had the luxury of dealing with on a frozen trail with 6 weeks between her and everything she had left to lose. She drove the wagon through stands of bare birch and across frozen creek beds, and told herself she was fine. The mule's name was Biscuit, which was the name Clara had given him and which Evelyn found undignified but had not changed because changing it felt like erasing something. Biscuit had opinions about pace and direction and communicated them through the angle of his ears and the particular quality of his stubbornness, and Evelyn had learned to read him the way you learn to read any difficult creature, carefully, and with the understanding that he was usually right. He didn't like the afternoon of the 4th day. He kept pulling left when the trail bent right, and when she corrected him, he'd go quiet for a stretch and then do it again, testing her. She was too tired to figure out what he knew that she didn't. Her leg ached from hip to ankle, and the cold was making it worse, and she'd been holding herself straight in the wagon seat for so long that her back had stopped complaining and gone numb, which she knew from experience was the worst option of the two. She stopped at dusk to make camp. Getting down from the wagon was harder than getting up had been that morning, which meant the leg was worse. She acknowledged this the way she acknowledged most unpleasant facts, briefly, directly, and then she moved past it because acknowledgement wasn't the same as surrender. She built a fire. She ate cold biscuit and the last of the dried apple and made coffee strong enough to see through, and she sat with her back against the wagon wheel and looked at the sky going dark through the bare branches and thought about Clara. Clara had been the gentler one. Evelyn had always known this and had spent most of their childhood being faintly contemptuous of it, the way you're contemptuous of something before you understand its value. Clara had believed people were mostly trying their best. Evelyn had believed people were mostly watching for your weak spots, and the years since had not substantially revised this position. But Clara had come west alone and homesteaded 40 acres and built a cabin with her own hands, so maybe gentleness wasn't the same thing as softness. Maybe Evelyn had gotten that wrong too. She put out the fire and climbed back into the wagon and pulled her blankets up and did not sleep well. The next morning she saw the other wagon. It was stopped at the crest of a low rise about a quarter-mile ahead, and she almost turned off the trail before she caught herself. Turning off the trail meant the rough ground, and the rough ground meant the leg, and the leg was already speaking to her in ways she didn't appreciate. She kept to the ruts and told herself she'd pass them without stopping. As she got closer, she could see it was a smaller rig than hers, a canvas-covered farm wagon with 2 horses, better kept than her own setup. A man was crouched beside the left rear wheel. A child was sitting up on the seat, bundled in so many layers he looked like a bundle of laundry that had learned to watch things. The man looked up when she came even with them. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, lean in the way that came from work rather than deprivation, with a few days of dark stubble and the kind of eyes that took in information without making a performance of it. He didn't call out to her. He just looked at her the way you look at someone when you're deciding how much trouble they represent. Axel Pin, he said, not explaining himself to her exactly, more like naming the problem in case she was curious. I'm not a wheelwright, she said. Didn't ask you to be. He went back to what he was doing. She should have kept going. She told Biscuit to go, and Biscuit went, and she was past them and up the rise before she let herself look back. The child on the wagon seat had turned to watch her go. He wasn't old, maybe 7, maybe 8, and he had the same quality of stillness as the man, the kind of stillness that isn't absence of feeling but something more like discipline, as if he'd learned early that some things weren't worth spending yourself on, though he was too young to have learned it easily. She faced front again. She drove another 200 yards. Then she stopped. She sat there for a long moment with the reins in her hands and the cold coming up through the wagon boards and Biscuit's ears going sideways at her indecision. Don't, she told herself. She turned the wagon around. His name was Nathan Cross. The boy was Eli. They were traveling to meet up with Nathan's brother-in-law in a settlement 3 weeks west, which was the same general direction Evelyn was going, which she did not mention because that information felt like something that could be used against her later. The axle pin wasn't broken, just worked loose, and she had a spare in her toolbox from when it had happened to her own wagon outside of Wichita 3 years ago. She handed it across without comment. Nathan looked at it, looked at her, and nodded once. He didn't say thank you. She respected that. Thank you between strangers on the frontier always felt like the start of an obligation neither party had agreed to. He fixed the pin in about 10 minutes. She waited because she wasn't going to drive away while she was still technically helping someone, that being the kind of thing that left you feeling poorly about yourself for the next several miles. You're alone, he said when he was back on his feet. I'm aware. Where are you headed? She looked at him. West. He accepted this. He had the good sense not to push, which she noted. Most men didn't have that sense, or had it, and chose not to use it around women traveling alone, as if her solitude was an invitation to concern. There's weather coming, he said. He was looking north, which was how you looked when you knew what you were looking at. The sky there had a particular flatness, a whiteness that wasn't cloud exactly, but wasn't clear either. Probably 2 days out, maybe less. I know. She'd been watching the same sky. You've got a lot of open ground between here and the Timber Ridge. I know that too. He looked at her for another moment with that same quality of assessment, and then he bent down and checked the wheel, straightened up, and that was apparently the end of it. She climbed back onto her wagon and got Biscuit moving. She'd gone about 100 yards when she heard the boy's voice behind her, not loud, just carrying in the way voices do in cold, still air. Pa, she's limping. She pretended not to hear it. The leg was worse by evening. She didn't stop to examine it because she didn't want to know what examining it would show her. She told herself she'd look at it when she made camp. And when she made camp, she told herself she'd look at it in the morning, and somewhere in the night she woke up with a fever that had come on fast and mean, and she lay in the wagon bed under her blanket sweating through her clothes and understood that she had run out of time to pretend. She unwrapped the leg by feel in the dark. The wound was bad. She'd known it was bad, had known it for days, But knowing a thing and seeing it were different propositions, and feeling it in the dark was worse than either. The skin around the cut was tight and hot and swollen in a way that told her the infection had gone deep, and there was a smell she recognized from injuries she'd tended in others that she had never wanted to smell on herself. She needed a doctor. There was no doctor within 2 days' travel, and she wasn't sure she had 2 days in her at the pace the fever was setting. She lay there and looked at the canvas overhead, and did the arithmetic with the same precision she applied to every problem she couldn't afford to get wrong, and every way she added it up came out the same. She was in trouble. She didn't let herself think past that. Thinking past it led to the thing she refused to look at directly, which was that she was alone on a frozen trail with a fever climbing, and nobody within calling distance who would come if she called. That was the thing she'd arranged her life around, being the one who didn't need to call. Being the one who was already there when others needed something. It had been easier that way after Robert. After Robert, needing had seemed like the most dangerous thing you could do. She wrapped the leg again. She told herself she'd manage in the morning. She didn't sleep. At first light, she heard wagon wheels on the trail behind her. She'd made it maybe 3 miles past the Crosses' camp before she'd had to stop for the night. Less than she'd wanted, much less. And it had taken her longer than she'd admitted to herself to get Biscuit unhitched and tended, and the camp made. She was sitting up in the wagon bed with her back against the tool chest when Nathan's rig came up the trail and stopped behind hers. He got down without hurrying, came around to where he could see her through the open tail of the canvas. He looked at her face first, the way people do when they're checking something, and then he looked at the leg, at the shape of it through the blanket, and whatever he saw there made him very still. "How long?" he said. "I'm fine." "How long has it been infected?" She looked past him at the tree line. "I don't need help." "That's not what I asked." The boy was watching from the wagon seat, that particular brand of worried but not showing it that she suspected he'd been taught by example. She looked at him for a moment and then back at his father. 10 days, she said. "Maybe 12. Nathan blew out a long, slow breath through his nose. Not angry, not surprised exactly. More like a man revising an estimate that had already been concerning. "Get your coat," he said. We need to look at it." "I told you. You told me you don't need help." He met her eyes without any drama. "I heard you. Now I need you to hear me. That leg goes another 2 days without attention, and you're not going to make it to wherever you're trying to get to. So you can keep telling me you're fine, or you can let me see it." She wanted to tell him to leave. She had the words ready, had been carrying them around for years like a tool she knew how to use. And they were right there, right on the edge of her tongue. She didn't say them. She pushed back the blanket instead. Nathan Cross had come west the first time at 19 with the surveying party, and had learned things that no one who'd stayed east ever quite believed. That the land itself had opinions, that weather could go from inconvenient to fatal in the time it took to eat a meal, and that the people most likely to die on the frontier were the ones most convinced they didn't need anything from anyone. He'd buried his wife 2 years ago from a fever that had started the same way as the one currently burning in the woman sitting in the back of a stranger's wagon on a frozen trail in the middle of November, and he had no intention of watching the same thing happen again to someone he could have helped. He cleaned the wound with water he'd heated over a campfire he built without asking permission. Evelyn Mercer sat with her back straight and her jaw set and didn't make a sound while he worked, which told him more about her than anything she'd said. She was the kind of woman who thought showing pain was a form of debt, that if you let someone see you hurting, you owed them something afterward. He'd been married to a woman like that. He understood the geometry of it even when he didn't agree with it. "It's not black," he said. "That's the good news." "What's the bad news?" "You need to keep it clean and stay off it for at least 3 days, neither of which you're going to do." "I have to reach a filing office before—" "I know." He hadn't known. But the way she'd said it, the flatness of it, like she was stating the terms of something that had already been decided, told him the rest. "Tell me where." She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at his hands, which he'd paused while waiting for her response, considering something. "Territorial office, 40 miles past my sister's claim. I've got 6 weeks." She paused. 5 weeks and 3 days now. "And you're what, 3 weeks out from the claim?" "Closer to 4, the way I've been traveling." He did the math. It was tight. It was very tight. If she was alone, and the weather the northern sky had been promising for 2 days came in the way it was shaped to. "Eli," he called. The boy appeared at the edge of the camp. He'd been gathering wood without being asked, which Nathan had noticed with the particular quality of pride that tried not to show itself. "Bring the small bag from under the bench." Eli went without asking what was in it. Nathan looked at Evelyn. "We're going the same direction," he said. "I don't recall telling you where I'm going." "You told me enough." She watched him with those careful eyes that hadn't softened any, even with a fever pushing behind them. "I don't need charity." "I'm not offering it." He took the bag from Eli when the boy brought it, found the cloth wrapping he wanted. "You had an axle pin when I needed one. Call it exchange and leave the ledger alone." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't travel well with people," she said. "Nobody does." He started wrapping the leg properly, the way the army surgeon who'd traveled with the surveying party had shown him years ago, snug but not binding. "That doesn't mean they don't travel." Evelyn looked out past the wagon canvas at the white sky to the north. "The weather's going to come in faster than 2 days," she said. "I know it." "Then why are you wasting time with this?" "Because this matters more than the weather." He tied off the bandage and sat back. "Can you drive your wagon?" "Yes." Without lying to me this time. She looked at him, and for just a moment something moved across her face that might have been the beginning of something other than resistance. Not warmth, exactly. Not trust. She didn't have the expression for trust, or if she'd ever had it, she'd lost the habit of it. But something. A hairline fracture in the way she was holding herself together. "Probably," she said. "If we don't push it." Nathan stood up. "Then we don't push it." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she took it and let him help her to her feet, and it cost her something. He could see it cost her. But she did it. Eli was already putting out the fire. They traveled together through the rest of that day and into the next. And the weather held, barely, the way weather on the northern frontier holds things sometimes. Not because the conditions have changed, but because it's gathering itself, organizing towards something worse. Evelyn drove her own wagon. She'd made that clear at the start and Nathan hadn't argued. She followed his rig rather than leading, which she'd done without comment, and he understood that she'd calculated the advantages and found this arrangement acceptable, which was the closest thing to flexibility he suspected she'd offered a stranger in a long time. Eli rode beside her for a stretch on the second afternoon, transferring from his father's wagon to hers with the ease of a child who'd been moving between spaces his whole life. He sat on the bench beside her with his hands in his pockets and looked at the trail ahead. "You're not going to ask me anything," Evelyn said after a while. "Pa says asking questions you already know the answer to is a waste of time." "What do you think you already know?" He considered this with a seriousness that sat oddly on a 7-year-old's face. "That you don't want us here." She glanced at him sideways. "That bother you?" "Not really." He picked at a thread on his coat sleeve. "People didn't want us a lot when Ma died. Then they did. People changed their minds." She looked at the trail. The birch trees on either side had gone to the particular gray-white of late November, the last of the bark darkening where the cold had gotten into the cracks, and the ground was hard enough now that the wagon wheels left only shallow impressions. "How long ago did your mother die?" she said. 2 years in March." "Do you remember her well?" He thought about it. The honesty of the pause, the refusal to give her a quick answer just because she'd asked, reminded her of his father in a way that was almost startling. The same quality of taking a question seriously. "Some parts good," he said. "Some parts it's like trying to remember a smell. You know it was there, but you can't quite get it back." Evelyn's hands tightened on the reins once, briefly, and then relaxed. "That's a true thing," she said. He nodded, like that settled something. The sky to the north had stopped being white and gone to a particular shade of gray that she'd only seen before once in her life, on a day in Kansas when a blizzard had come in off the plains so fast that the men working the far field hadn't made it back to the barn. She'd been 16. She remembered standing at the window watching the gray come and not yet knowing what it meant. She knew now. "Eli," she said. "Ma'am." "Go back to your father's wagon." He looked at the sky, that same reading look she'd seen on Nathan's face, and he didn't argue. He moved to transfer back, easy and quick, and she was already clicking Biscuit forward, trying to close the distance between her rig and Nathan's, trying to do it without making it look like what it was, which was hurrying, which was fear. Nathan had already seen the sky. He was looking back at her over his shoulder when she came up even with him, and his face had the particular tightness of a man who was revising his timeline dramatically downward. "How far to shelter?" she said. "There's an abandoned claim maybe 6 miles east. I saw it on the survey map." He looked north again. 6 miles is a long 6 miles in what's coming. The first flake of snow came down and landed on Evelyn's coat sleeve and lay there for a moment, perfect, before it vanished. "Then we'd better not waste time talking about it," she said. She meant it, and for the first time since they'd been traveling together, Nathan Cross looked at her. Not with the careful assessment of a man deciding how much trouble she represented, but with something that recognized something. And he nodded. They turned east, both wagons, into the last of the daylight. The snow began to fall in earnest as the darkness came down, and it fell the way it always falls when it means business. Quietly, steadily, with a patience that has no interest in what you need it to do. They made it to the abandoned claim with maybe 20 minutes of real visibility left. Nathan found the cabin by memory and the survey map he'd been carrying folded in his coat pocket since Caldwell. A rough sketch, hand-drawn by a land office clerk who'd been paid poorly and hadn't cared much, but accurate enough for the main features. The cabin sat back from a frozen creek in a stand of spruce that had grown up around it like the trees were trying to reclaim what the settlers had borrowed. The door had swollen shut. Nathan put his shoulder into it twice before it gave. Inside was cold and dark and smelled of old soot and something that had nested there in the summer and was long gone. A stone hearth took up most of the north wall. 2 rope beds with no mattresses, a plank table, a single chair with a cracked leg. Someone had left a cord of wood stacked against the east wall, dry enough to be useful, which was the best thing Evelyn had seen in 3 days. She got down from the wagon slowly, putting most of her weight on the right leg, the way she'd been doing all afternoon without quite admitting she was doing it. The snow was coming hard now, the flakes smaller and faster than when it had started, which meant it meant business. She unhitched Biscuit and got him into the lean-to on the south side of the cabin where Nathan's horses were already standing close together for warmth, and she took longer with it than she should have because her hands were cold and clumsy, and the fever she'd been fighting down with sheer will for the last 6 hours was making the edges of things slightly soft. Nathan was inside getting a fire started when she came in. Eli was already at the woodstack, carrying pieces to the hearth with the focused competence of a child who had been taught useful things. "Sit down," Nathan said without turning around. "I need to check Biscuits." "He's fine. Sit down." She sat. Not because he told her to, but because the chair was there and her leg had decided to stop negotiating. The fire took hold in the hearth, and the smell of burning wood filled the small space, and outside the blizzard came down like something that had been patient for a long time and was done being patient. The wind found every gap in the cabin walls, and there were more gaps than she would have liked. But the spruce trees broke the worst of it, and the stone hearth was sound, and within an hour the temperature inside had risen to something that only felt cold rather than dangerous. Eli fell asleep on one of the rope beds with his coat still on, which was the right thing to do. Nathan sat by the fire with his elbows on his knees and looked at it the way men look at fires when they're thinking about things they're not saying. Evelyn unwrapped her leg. She did it quietly, hoping he wouldn't notice, which was optimistic given that they were in a single room roughly the size of a modest parlor. He noticed. He looked at it, and then he looked at her face, and she met his look with the same expression she'd been giving him since the beginning of this, which was the expression that said she was managing. "It's worse," he said. "It's the same." The red line. He nodded at her leg, at the streak of color moving up from the wound toward her knee. "That wasn't there this morning?" She looked at it. She'd noticed it this afternoon and had told herself it was the cold, the way the blood moved differently in the cold, which was not something she actually believed but had found temporarily useful. "I know what it is," she said. He was quiet. "I know what it means," she said. "I've tended enough injuries." "Then you know we can't stay here and we can't leave." Outside, the blizzard answered that plainly. The sound of it against the cabin walls was the sound of a thing that didn't care about deadlines or deeds or the distance between a woman and the land she was trying to save. Evelyn wrapped the leg again. Her hands weren't entirely steady, and she was aware of this, and she wrapped it anyway. There might be something in the wagons, she said. Herbs, poultice material. I have a kit. Tell me where and I'll get it. I'll get it myself. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had decided some fights weren't worth the energy they cost. Where is it? She told him. He came back with her kit and with a few other things he'd found in his own supplies. A small tin of drawing salve that his wife had packed when they'd left Missouri 2 years ago and that he'd carried since without knowing exactly why, a strip of boiled cloth, 2 extra blankets. He set them on the table and didn't make anything of it, didn't present them the way a man presents a kindness when he wants to make sure you've noticed. He just set them there and went back to tending the fire. She made the poultice herself. She knew the combination. Her mother had taught her, the way frontier women taught their daughters things that didn't come from books, because the people who wrote the books had mostly never been that far from a town. Dried plantain leaf, pine resin from a small jar in her kit, a little vinegar. It wouldn't cure anything, but it might slow the moving line, might buy her another day or two, and 2 days was something she could work with. She applied it and lay back on the second rope bed and looked at the ceiling, which had a crack running from the east wall to the center beam that she traced twice with her eyes before she let herself close them. She didn't intend to sleep. She closed her eyes for a moment to rest them, and when she opened them again, the fire had burned lower, and Nathan was sitting in the chair reading something, a small book she didn't recognize, holding it close to the light. The storm outside had not quieted. "What time is it?" she said. "Late." He didn't look up. "How do you feel?" "Better." Which was half true. The fever had backed off a little, or she'd gotten too tired to feel it as clearly. The leg still ached, but the particular sharp throb of it had shifted to something duller, which might mean the poultice was working, or might just mean she'd been lying down. He closed the book. "You want to tell me what you're actually trying to do, or keep giving me compass directions?" She looked at the ceiling again. "I told you. Filing office. Sister's claim." "You told me the what. I'm asking about the rest of it." He wasn't pressing, exactly. It was the quality of genuine curiosity that doesn't need you to answer, which was different from the kind that's really just a different form of demand. She was quiet for a moment. "My sister spent 4 years building something," she said finally. "She had nobody out here. She came because her husband died and she had nothing, and the homestead provisions gave her a chance and she took it and she worked it. She died in September of a bad autumn and she never got to see it finished." She paused. "Harmon Land and Cattle has been filing competing claims on widows' homesteads all along this corridor for 3 years. They let the woman do the hard part, and then they filed the dispute right after her death, and the claim defaults to them. They've done it before. 7 times that I know of. The families don't have the money to contest it legally, and by the time they understand what's happened, it's done." She turned her head and looked at him. "Clara's land has a spring-fed creek, good grass in the south field. Harmon knows exactly what he has if he gets it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "And you came alone because there wasn't anyone else." He accepted that. Not quickly, the way people accept things they're not really thinking about, but after a real pause, the kind that meant he'd actually considered it. "Who taught you to be like this?" he said. She looked at him. "Like what?" "Like asking for help is a worse outcome than dying of it." The fire popped once in the silence. Eli shifted on his bed without waking. "My husband," she said. "Or rather, what came after my husband?" She said it flat, without inflection. "He was charming, and I was 22, and I thought that people who were good at needing you were the same as people who were worth needing. By the time I understood the difference, I'd already signed over the right to make decisions about my own money, my own land, my own time." She stopped. "When he left, I had nothing that was mine. I started over. I told myself I wasn't going to arrange my life so that it required anyone else to hold together." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. "That makes sense," he said. "I know it does. It also doesn't work, long term. It was working fine until 2 weeks ago. The leg, I don't mean the leg." She looked at the fire. "The leg is a problem. I mean the rest of it. Being alone isn't a failure. Depending on the wrong people is a failure. I'm careful about who I depend on." A pause, shorter this time. "Or I was." He looked at her and she looked at the fire, and the storm came down outside like it would never stop. "I'm not him," Nathan said, quietly. not defensively. I know. She said it without looking at him. That doesn't make it simple. No, he agreed. It doesn't. The blizzard lasted 2 days. Not the gentle eastern variety of blizzard that dropped a foot of snow and let you move through it carefully. The frontier kind. The kind that had geography and momentum, that came off the mountain passes with the full weight of the continent behind it, and settled in like a long argument you weren't going to win. By the second morning, the snow around the cabin was past the lower window ledge, and the lean-to where the animals sheltered had drifted in on one side, so that Nathan had to dig it out twice a day to keep the horses breathing clearly. He did this without complaint, methodically, with the same quality he seemed to bring to everything that needed doing. Not enthusiasm, not resignation, just application. Like a man who had made peace with the idea that most of what life required was simply showing up for it. Evelyn watched him from the window when he went out each time, partly to verify that the storm wasn't doing anything new that they needed to plan around, and partly because watching someone work well is a thing you don't entirely stop doing even when you want to. The leg was better on the second morning. Not healed, she wasn't confused about that, but the moving line had stopped moving, which was the thing that mattered. The fever had broken properly overnight, leaving her wrung out and clearer-headed than she'd been in days, the way a fever breaking always leaves you, like coming up through the surface of cold water into air that's sharper than it seemed before. Eli had taken to her in the way children take to people they've decided are worth the effort, gradually, without announcement, in the specific form of proximity. He didn't ask her many questions. He sat near her when he was inside and occasionally offered her things. A cup of coffee, a piece of hardtack, once a small rock he'd apparently been carrying in his pocket for reasons he didn't explain. She accepted these without making them into anything. He seemed to appreciate that. "Can you read?" he asked her on the second afternoon. Not hopefully exactly, more like gathering information. "I can." He reached into his coat and produced a small, battered volume, the same one she'd seen his father reading by the fire. "Pa's read me this one, but he does the voices wrong." She took the book. It was a collection of adventure stories, the kind printed cheaply for children, the cover worn soft and the corners bent from handling. She opened it to a page he'd marked with a strip of leather. "How does he do the voices wrong?" she said. "He makes the pirate sound like our neighbor Mr. Hedges, from Missouri. Mr. Hedges talked like he was always asking a question." She looked at the page. Then she read 3 pages to Eli, doing the pirate correctly, and he sat with his knees pulled up and listened with the complete attention of a child who has not yet learned to pretend he doesn't care about the things that hold him. Nathan came in from checking the animals while she was reading and stopped just inside the door, brushing snow from his coat, and stood there for a moment listening without making it obvious he was doing so, which was obvious anyway, and she didn't stop reading. That evening, with the storm still going and the fire settled into its longer burn, Eli asleep again. He slept like a practical creature, whenever the circumstances allowed. She and Nathan sat at the plank table with the last of the coffee and talked, not about the leg, or the claim, or the filing deadline, about other things, about Missouri, which he'd left with his wife and Eli when Eli was 4, chasing the idea that the territory would be better, about Kansas, which had not been better in the ways they'd hoped, about his wife Catherine, who had been funny, properly funny, he said, not trying to be funny, which is the worst kind, and who had died of a fever in the late spring 2 years ago in a town where the nearest doctor was 30 miles south, and the roads had been impassable. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "I know." He said it the way she'd said things, without a lot around it, but meaning it. "Did you think about going back east afterward?" "Every day for about 6 months." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Then I stopped thinking about it. Going back wasn't going to be what I remembered. It was going to be the place I left, with everything I'd expected to come back to already gone." She understood this precisely, in the specific way you understand something you've never quite found the words for before hearing someone else say it. "So west," she said. "So west." A brief pause. "My brother-in-law has a mill operation. Said he could use a man who knows how to run a survey and do accounts. It's not what I'd have planned." He looked at the fire. "But Eli needs something that looks like settled." She thought about Clara's land, about the creek and the south field, and the 4 years of work that had made it something real. About the cabin Clara had built. She'd never seen it, but Clara's letters had described it in the particular detail of someone proud of what she'd made, the way the east-facing window caught the morning light, the way the creek sounded in spring. "What do you do?" Nathan said. "After the filing, if it works." She hadn't expected the question. She'd been so focused on the before that the after had stayed vague, the way destinations always seem slightly unreal until you're close enough to see them clearly. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Live there. Work it. The deed says 80 acres. There's a creek." She paused. Clara had the beginnings of a kitchen garden. "I know from her letters it was doing well before she stopped, started again. I thought I'd finish what she started." He nodded slowly. "Alone," he said. Not accusing, just placing the word where it needed to go. That was the plan. He didn't say anything else about it. She was aware, in the way you're sometimes aware of a space left deliberately empty, that he had stopped there on purpose. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. Not gradually. The frontier didn't do much gradually when it decided to shift, but between 1 hour and the next, the wind stopped, and the sky went from the solid gray that had been sitting over them since they'd arrived to a blue so bright and cold it almost hurt. The snow lay everywhere, deep and undisturbed, and the spruce trees wore it in thick sleeves that bent the branches low. Nathan went out first to assess the damage and came back with information and without editorializing, which she appreciated. The lean-to was intact. The horses and Biscuit were cold but sound. The trail east toward the main route was going to be rough for the first 5 or 6 miles, until they hit ground that other travelers had already broken, but it was passable. Snow depth on the open ground was about 2.5 feet, which the wagons could manage if they were careful. What he didn't say, and what she calculated herself while he was speaking, 3 days lost. She had 5 weeks and 3 days as of when they'd sheltered in, which was now 5 weeks dead flat, which was still manageable, but there was no more give in it. Any further delay and the deadline started closing faster than she could travel. She said this aloud, plainly. Nathan listened and then said, "Then we leave today." They broke camp in 2 hours, which was faster than she'd expected, because Eli was helpful in the specific way of a child who's learned to read urgency without needing it explained. He packed what he could carry, fed and watered the animals while Nathan repacked the wagons, and came to stand beside Evelyn when she was tightening the lashings on her canvas without being asked to, just holding the corner of it against the wind until she got the tie finished. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. But he stood a little straighter. The first miles were as hard as Nathan had said. The horses worked and Biscuit worked, and Evelyn stood in the wagon seat rather than sitting, because sitting meant she couldn't shift her weight when the wheels found something under the snow that wasn't quite what it looked like from the surface. Her leg held. It complained. There was no world in which it didn't complain. But the deep wrong heat of the infection had settled to something manageable, and she could work with manageable. By noon, they'd found a stretch of trail that a freight wagon had already broken sometime in the last 24 hours, and the going improved dramatically. The sun was full on them now, the cold, bright kind that gave light without much warmth, and the snow threw it back at you from every surface so that the whole world seemed to be lit from multiple directions at once. Nathan came back alongside her around midday. He'd been riding ahead to check conditions and came back with his horse, which he'd started using when the wagon pace became too slow for scouting. She had not asked when he started doing this, or why he'd decided it was his job to ride ahead for a party that was technically not his party. She had let it happen the way she let the other things happen, not gratefully, not as acknowledgement of debt, but because it was practical, and she was capable of being practical about things that didn't cost her what she wasn't prepared to pay. "There's a settlement about 10 miles south," he said, coming even with her wagon. 2 hours, maybe less if the trail holds. They'll have a store, possibly a doctor. He looked at her leg and then at her face, the same check he'd been running every morning. "How far south is that going to put us?" "Half a day. We could make it up if the weather holds." She thought about it. The leg had been better this morning, but better wasn't fixed, and fixed was what she needed if she was going to do the last hard push. "All right," she said. He nodded and started to pull ahead. "Nathan," he looked back, "I need you to not do the thing where you tell the doctor it's worse than it is to make sure I stay." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, but decided against it. "I wouldn't do that." "You might. You seem like someone who decides what's best and then works backward from there. You seem like someone who decides what's best and then argues with anyone who agrees with you. She looked at him. He looked at her. The horses blew steam into the cold air. Fair, she said. He rode ahead. She kept her eyes on the trail and did not let herself think about the feeling in her chest when he said it. That particular off-balance feeling, like a step you expected to land one way and landed another. She'd had it twice now in his presence, and she didn't like it, not because it was painful, but because it was unfamiliar in the way a sound is unfamiliar when you've been in silence a long time. She focused on the trail, on the mileage, on Clara's land and the filing deadline and the shape of the things she'd come all this way to do. The settlement was called Harlow's Creek, which was an optimistic name for 8 buildings arranged around a crossroads as if they'd fallen there from somewhere else. There was a trading post, a livery, a building that served as both a boarding house and a saloon depending on the time of day, and several structures of less obvious purpose. There was also, improbably, a doctor. His name was Aldous Ferris. He was approximately 60 years old, and he had the manner of a man who had seen too much to be alarmed by most things, and not quite enough to be indifferent. He looked at Evelyn's leg for 3 minutes, asked her 2 questions about the onset and the timeline, examined the moving line that had stopped moving, and then sat back in his chair. You did the right thing with the poultice, he said. I know. Another 48 hours without it, and I'd be having a different conversation with you. I know that too. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. The infection needs another week of rest and continued care to clear properly. Full rest, not modified rest. He paused. I suspect you're not going to do that. I have a filing deadline. I was told. He glanced toward the door, and she understood that Nathan had spoken to him. She let this go. What I can give you is a proper cleaning, a better dressing than what you've managed on the trail, and something for the pain that won't slow your thinking. What I can't give you is a guarantee that pushing it won't set you back further. I understand the risk. Understanding it and accepting it are different. I've accepted it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he got to work. Nathan was in the trading post with Eli when she came out, buying supplies for the next stretch. She found them at the counter, Eli carefully examining a piece of hard candy the store owner had apparently produced, Nathan tallying something on a piece of paper. He looked up when she came in, and she gave him a short nod, meaning the leg, meaning it was handled, meaning don't ask me more than that in front of the boy. And he received this and turned back to his tally. She bought what she needed, plantain leaf, vinegar, a roll of proper bandaging cloth, a small tin of salve that cost more than it should have. She counted out the money without hesitation, though the counting left her with less than she liked. At the counter, while Nathan was settling his own bill, she heard the store owner mention Harmon. She looked up. Moving men into the corridor, the man was saying, in the confidential tone of someone sharing information because it made him feel important. Bought out the Peterson claim last month, and the Hartwell widow's land is up next, they say. Got a man filed in the territorial office already. Evelyn set her hands flat on the counter. The Hartwell claim, she said. You said widow. The store owner looked at her. Clara Hartwell. She passed in September. Land goes back to open territory if no next of kin files before. I'm next of kin, she said it evenly. I'm filing. He blinked. Recalibrated the same way the doctor had. Harmon's been telling people that claim is secured. Harmon's wrong. The man looked at her for a moment, then at Nathan, who was standing slightly behind her and to her left and had said nothing. There was something in Nathan's posture, not threatening, not exactly, but the quality of a man who has chosen his position deliberately, that the store owner registered and filed away. Well, he said, I suppose we'll see. We will, Evelyn said. She picked up her purchases and walked out, and Nathan followed, and neither of them spoke until they were past the door and into the clean cold of the street. Harmon has a man at the territorial office, she said. I heard. That changes the timeline. She was already working through it, the math of it, the sequence of what needed to happen in what order. I need to file before he can process whatever Harmon's man has submitted. If it's already in queue, I need a territorial judge, not just a clerk. That takes longer. That means, Evelyn. Nathan's voice was quiet. She stopped talking. One problem at a time. She looked at him. We get to the claim first, he said. Then we figure out the office. Then the judge, if it needs to be a judge. She looked at him for a moment. The sun was hitting the snow in the street between them, throwing light up at angles that made everything very bright and very clear. We, she said. He met her look. He didn't repeat it or explain it. He let it sit there, which was exactly right, because explaining it would have made it something else, something with conditions attached, and this was just the word plain. She looked away first, down the street toward the trail north. We need to move, she said. Today, before the afternoon gets soft. Agreed. Eli appeared from the door of the trading post with the piece of hard candy in his cheek, making the side of his face lumpy, and looked between them with the particular attention of a child monitoring a situation he can feel but can't name. Are we going? He said. We're going, Nathan said. Eli transferred the candy to the other cheek, which apparently needed to be evened out, and went to get his coat from the wagon. Evelyn looked at the trail north one more time. 5 weeks to the deadline. A corrupt filing agent at the territorial office. 2 wagons, 3 people, 1 bad leg, and 600 miles of frontier between her and the land she'd promised herself she'd save. She thought about Clara, about the east-facing window and the sound of the creek in spring and the kitchen garden that needed finishing. She thought about Nathan's voice saying we and the specific way it had landed. She walked to her wagon and climbed up and got Biscuit moving, and the cold air came off the snow in waves, and the trail north ran out ahead of them like a sentence that hadn't found its end yet. The trail north out of Harlow's Creek was better than the trail that had brought them in, which wasn't saying much but was saying something. A freight route ran parallel to the main corridor about 2 miles east, and Nathan had gotten directions from the liveryman before they left. A man of few words who communicated primarily through the angle of his arm and the quality of his silence, but whose directions proved accurate. The freight route was broken and packed by heavy wagon traffic, and they made good time for 3 days, better time than Evelyn had made alone, and she was honest enough with herself to note this without making it mean more than it meant. The leg continued to improve. Not quickly and not without complaint, but the red line stayed where it was and then slowly faded, and by the 4th day out of Harlow's Creek she could put full weight on it for short stretches without the deep ache that had been telling her something was fundamentally wrong. Dr. Ferris's dressing held. She changed it each morning with the methodical care of someone who understood that the difference between manageable and catastrophic was mostly maintenance. They had settled into a traveling pattern without discussing it, which was the only way traveling patterns actually work. Nathan rode ahead to check conditions and came back with information. Eli rode with whichever wagon needed ballast on difficult ground, shifting between them without ceremony. Evelyn drove Biscuit and kept her own counsel, and at the end of each day's travel did her fair share of camp making without being asked and without waiting to be thanked. What had changed, and she noticed it in the way you notice a change in weather before you can name what's different, was that she'd stopped spending energy on the vigilance she'd been carrying since Caldwell. The low-grade attention she'd been paying to Nathan's every word and movement, watching for the shape of an agenda, the particular way a generosity reveals what it costs. She hadn't turned it off deliberately. It had simply become less necessary, and eventually she'd noticed it had quieted. She didn't examine this too closely, but she noticed it. On the 5th night out of Harlow's Creek, they camped in a hollow between 2 low ridges where the wind was broken enough to make a real fire possible. And Nathan fried salt pork in the pan, and Eli made biscuits in the Dutch oven with the serious attention of someone who had been taught this skill by someone who valued it. And the 3 of them ate together in the firelight, and the evening was cold and clear, and Evelyn told them about Clara. Not everything. Not the years before. Not their childhood, or their parents, or the particular kind of distance that can grow between sisters who love each other but are built differently. She told them about the letters. Clara had written every 3 weeks, sometimes more, the handwriting getting more confident over the years as if the land itself had steadied something in her hand. She told them about the creek Clara had described in 4 different letters at 4 different seasons, the way it ran in spring and went low in August and froze along the edges in November, but never fully, Clara had written, never fully even in the worst cold. She sounds like she was brave, Eli said. She was practical, Evelyn said, which ends up looking like bravery from the outside. Nathan was watching her from across the fire, not with the assessment look, She knew that look by now, and this wasn't it. Something quieter. "You're alike," he said. She started to disagree and then thought about it. "Maybe," she said, though she was better with people. "That's not the same as being different." She looked at him. He looked at the fire. She let it go. Eli fell asleep before the fire did, which was his habit, and Nathan banked it down and they sat in the diminished light for a few minutes, in the silence that had become comfortable without either of them declaring it so. 4 weeks, she said. She wasn't asking him to calculate anything, just naming what she was carrying. 4 weeks is enough, he said, if the weather holds. The weather won't hold. No, he agreed, but it doesn't have to hold completely, just enough. She looked north, where the mountain line was a darker dark against the night sky. The passes up there were what she was thinking about. The passes were where the last serious weather would come from. And serious was the word she was holding carefully, because what it meant on the frontier was not the same as what it meant anywhere else. "Tell me about the passes," she said. 2 of them, he said. "The lower one is longer, but it stays under 4,000 feet. The high one cuts 3 days off the route, but it's exposed on the western face." He'd been studying the survey map since Harlow's Creek, adding what he'd learned from the liveryman and from a freight driver they'd spoken to briefly on the second day out. "This time of year, the high pass is a gamble." "How much of a gamble?" "Depends on timing. If we hit it in a good window, we lose nothing. If we hit it wrong..." He stopped. "Say it." "If we hit it wrong, we could lose everything." She was quiet. She did the arithmetic the way she always did it. The same precision, the same refusal to let the number be what she wanted it to be rather than what it was. "We take the high pass," she said. He looked at her. 4 weeks is enough if everything goes right, she said. The low pass means we need everything to go right. The high pass gives us margin if we time it. It also eliminates the margin if we don't. "I know the math, Nathan." He was quiet for a moment. "So do I," he said. "I just want to make sure we're both doing it." She met his eyes across the diminished fire. "We are." He nodded once. "High pass," he said. "We watch the sky and we move fast." The country changed as they climbed. The birch and spruce of the lower corridor gave way to stands of pine that grew, the way pines grow at altitude, twisted, deliberate, shaped by decades of wind into forms that looked like decisions. The trail narrowed and steepened, and the wagons required more management, more attention to the angle of the grade and the mood of the animals, and the condition of the surface underfoot. Ice had formed in sheltered spots along the trail, the kind that looked like ordinary shadow until a wheel found it and told you otherwise. Evelyn's leg, which had been holding, began to protest the cold in a new way. Not the infected heat of before, but the stiffness of scar tissue tightening in low temperature. The way healed injuries remember themselves when the conditions change. She drove through it and said nothing about it, and Nathan didn't ask. Which she was beginning to understand was his way of respecting the line between noticing and intruding. On the 8th day out of Harlow's Creek, 3 days into the mountain approach, Eli got a cold. It started as a runny nose and an occasional cough, the standard frontier child ailment that usually ran its course in 4 or 5 days, with no intervention beyond keeping the child warm and moderately rested. Nathan was matter-of-fact about it, and Eli bore it with the same practical stoicism he brought to most difficulties, and Evelyn told herself it was nothing to concern herself with. By the 10th day, the cough had changed. She noticed it first because she was a light sleeper, and the sounds of the camp at night had become as familiar to her as the sounds of whatever house she'd been sleeping in. She always mapped a new space by its sounds before she mapped it visually, an old habit. And the quality of Eli's cough in the small hours of the 10th night was different from the quality it had been the days before. Deeper. With a particular wet sound underneath it that she'd heard before in children and didn't like hearing. She lay still and listened and did not wake Nathan because there was nothing to be done at that hour that wasn't already being done. The boy was warm, he was sleeping between coughs, the fire was adequate. But in the morning she watched Eli with the careful attention she'd been trained by experience to apply. And what she saw made her say quietly, when Eli was occupied with the horses, "His color is wrong." Nathan looked at the boy. He'd been watching him too. She could tell from the quality of his looking, the way it wasn't casual. "Since this morning?" "Since last night. The cough's gone down into his chest." Nathan's jaw tightened once and then released. How bad? Not bad yet. Could stay not bad. She paused. Could go the other way fast, up here. Cold air isn't helping. He looked at the mountain ahead and then back at his son, and she watched him do the math she'd already done. The same impossible arithmetic of what they needed against what the situation was asking. We need shelter, he said. Not camp, real shelter. The survey map had an abandoned claim marked about 6 miles up the western approach, before the exposed section. I saw it. If it's intact, we push for it. He turned to Eli. Son, how do you feel? Eli looked up from the horse he'd been brushing with more optimism than thoroughness. Fine, he said, in the voice of a child who was not going to be the reason the adults changed their plans. Nathan and Evelyn looked at each other. Ride in the wagon, Nathan said. Eli started to argue and then looked at his father's face and reconsidered. Which one? Evelyn's. It's got the better canvas. Eli transferred without further protest, which told them both something about how he actually felt. He climbed into the wagon bed and burrowed into the blankets Evelyn had already arranged without making it look like she'd arranged them, and she got Biscuit moving and tried not to think about what the sky to the north had been doing since dawn. It had been doing something. The particular white-gray flatness had been building since first light, and the wind at altitude had a different sound from the wind below, a lower register, something you felt in the chest more than heard in the ears. She'd been watching it all morning without discussing it because there was nothing useful to say about it that they weren't both already thinking. The cabin on the survey map was there, which was the first good thing that had happened since Eli's cough changed its character. It was in better shape than the last one. The roof had been maintained by someone or had simply been built by someone competent, which amounted to the same thing, and the hearth worked, and there was wood enough in the lean-to for several days if they were careful. They got Eli inside and warmed and dosed with the willow bark tea Evelyn made from her kit, while Nathan tended the animals and checked the cabin for structural problems. She sat with the boy while the tea steeped and the fire established itself, and she could hear the wind beginning its new business outside, moving through the pines in a way that was no longer exploratory, but committed. Eli drank the tea with the expression of someone accepting an unpleasant thing on good authority. Is it bad? He said. The tea? The weather. She looked at him. He was 7 years old and had been watching the sky the same way the adults did for days, reading it with the instruments available to him, trying to understand his own situation. It might be, she said. We're inside, though. Pa will be worried about the animals. Your pa is handling the animals. You handle the tea. He drank more of it, coughed. The cough still had the wet sound she didn't like. Will I get better? She didn't tell him he was fine. She'd noticed he didn't like being told he was fine when things weren't clearly fine, that he inherited from his father the preference for accurate information over comfortable information, and she respected it enough to honor it. You're going to feel worse before you feel better, she said. That's how chest colds work, but you've got warmth and medicine, and you're not out in what's coming, which means your situation is considerably better than it could be. He considered this. What's in the tea besides bad? Willow bark. It'll help the fever if you get one. Is it bad if I get one? A small fever is your body fighting. A big fever is something else. How do you tell the difference? You check it regularly, and you don't pretend it's smaller than it is. He nodded. You'd tell me. I'd tell you, she said, and meant it, which was the thing he'd been actually asking. Nathan came in from outside with snow on his shoulders, and that particular tight look he got when he was managing something internally that he wasn't going to discuss in front of the boy. Animals are settled, he said. Lean-to's solid. He looked at Eli and then at Evelyn with the question in his eyes that he wasn't going to ask aloud. Willow bark's in him, she said. Fever's not up yet. He nodded. Came to crouch by his son. Put his hand on the boy's forehead with the practiced ease of a parent who'd done it enough times that it was a calibrated instrument. You warm enough? Yeah. Eli leaned his head slightly into his father's hand, the small automatic movement of a child seeking contact, and Nathan stayed where he was for a moment longer than the temperature check required. Outside, the blizzard arrived. It was worse than this first one. Or perhaps it was the same and they were simply higher up, where weather had more leverage over everything below it. But the sound of it was different. The cabin walls worked harder, and the gaps in the plank boards showed cold air moving through in thin streams that they blocked with strips of cloth and pieces of their own clothing, whatever came to hand. The temperature inside dropped despite the fire, which they fed carefully, and the light from outside went from gray to dark gray to the particular nothing of a blizzard at altitude. By nightfall, Eli had a fever, not a large one. She checked it twice with the back of her hand and her own established baseline, and it was elevated but not alarmingly so, the small fever she'd told him about, the fighting kind. But the cough was worse in the night air, and the boy slept badly, waking every hour or so to cough himself back toward consciousness, and then slide back down again into the fractured sleep of an illness that wouldn't quite let go. Nathan sat with him through the first half of the night, and Evelyn took the second half without being asked, because she was awake anyway, and because Nathan had not slept properly since the cough changed its quality, and she could see the particular gray of extended vigilance in his face. "Go lie down," she said, around the midpoint of the night. You're running on nothing, and tomorrow is going to need you functional." She met his eyes across the sleeping boy. "I'll wake you if anything changes." He looked at her. He was in the same position she'd been in, over and over, for the past 2 weeks. The position of someone being offered help and having to decide what it cost. She watched him figure out it didn't cost anything, and sit back, and after a while he slept, which was the kind of trust that didn't announce itself and didn't need to. She sat with Eli and monitored the fever and added wood to the fire in careful measured increments and listened to the blizzard make its case outside. She was tired, genuinely tired, bone-tired in the way that the weeks of this had accumulated. But she'd found over the years that there was a kind of tiredness you push through because something on the other side of it needed doing, and that was different from the kind you surrendered to. Somewhere in the second hour of the night, alone with the fire and the sleeping boy and the storm, she let herself think about what she was doing. Not the claim, not the deadline, or the filing office, or the man Harmon had placed there to obstruct it. She thought about what she was actually doing at this moment. Sitting in a cold mountain cabin tending a fever for a child who was not hers, in the company of a man she'd met 12 days ago on a trail she'd been trying to travel alone. She thought about the word Nathan had used in the street at Harlow's Creek. We. She thought about the way Eli had leaned his head into his father's hand. She thought about Clara's letters, all of them, and the one she'd received in July that she'd read 6 times before she understood what it was saying. Not the words, but underneath the words. Which was that Clara was lonely, in the specific way you can only be lonely after you've built something real, when the realness of it makes the absence of someone to share it with more precise and more heavy. She thought, maybe I've been wrong about what strength looks like. She didn't say it, she wasn't ready to say it, but she let herself think it, which was a different kind of movement, a smaller gear turning, beginning to engage something larger. Eli coughed. She put her hand on his back the way she'd seen his father do it, and he settled, and she kept her hand there for a moment, and then moved to add wood to the fire. At some point in the deepest part of the night, Nathan woke and went to the wood supply, armful, and found the stack beside the hearth low. They looked at each other in the firelight. "I should go get more," he said, quietly, so as not to wake Eli. She looked at the lean-to through the shuttered window. The sound of the blizzard had not diminished. "It's bad out. There's a cord in the lean-to, 30 feet from the door. In a whiteout at altitude that's not 30 feet, that's a direction problem." He knew this. She could see he knew this. But the fire needed wood, and the wood was outside, and the wood was what stood between Eli's fever and something significantly worse. "I'll rope to the doorframe," he said. She looked at the rope he was already reaching for, the coil that had been in his wagon supplies. She looked at the door. She looked at him. "I'll hold the line from here," she said. "3 pulls if you need to come back fast." He paused. "You don't have to—" "3 pulls," she said. "You'll feel them through the rope." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have a ready category for, something that wasn't gratitude exactly, and wasn't relief exactly, but was in the territory of both. He tied off to the doorframe and went out. She held the rope. She paid attention to the tension in it, to the small communications of a man moving through deep snow in darkness and wind, the way the line went slack when he stopped and taut when he moved, the particular language of it that she'd never spoken but understood the grammar of from the first moment she took it. He was gone 11 minutes. She counted, because counting was something to do that wasn't worrying or was a form of worrying with structure imposed on it. When he came back, he brought enough wood for the rest of the night and most of the morning. He was snow-covered from head to boot, and the cold had gone into him the way it does when you're exposed at altitude, a deep cold that doesn't release quickly. And she built the fire up and he sat close to it, and she gave him the blanket off her own shoulders without making it a decision, just did it the way you do things that are obvious. He looked at the blanket. He looked at her. "How's Eli?" he said, instead of what the expression was. "Fever's holding level, not climbing." She looked at the boy. "The cough's a little better since midnight." He exhaled. Something that had been very tight in him for the last several hours released incrementally. "He's tough," she said. "He is." Nathan looked at his son. "He got that from his mother." She was quiet for a moment. "He got it from both of you." Nathan looked at her. The fire was between them, and the night was the particular depth of night when the night is most itself. And she held his gaze for a moment and then looked at Eli, because looking at Nathan in that moment felt like standing at the edge of a thing she wasn't ready to step into or step back from. "Sleep," she said. "I've got the rest of it." "You haven't slept." "I'll sleep when it's light." He didn't argue this time. He rearranged himself beside his son, and the exhaustion did what exhaustion does to even careful people. And within a few minutes, he was asleep again, his hand finding Eli's in sleep the way a hand finds a familiar thing in the dark. She sat with the fire and the rope still loosely in her hand from the outside, and the blizzard and the long night, and the sensation of something having shifted in the architecture of her interior in a way she wasn't ready to name but couldn't honestly deny. She stayed awake until the gray light of morning found the cabin's one small window, and then she put the rope down and checked Eli's fever. Lower, distinctly lower, moving in the right direction. And she built the fire up one more time, and she sat back and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind was quieter. Not gone. Not done. But the pitch of it had changed from the roaring business of full assault to something more like argument winding down, and she had been on the frontier long enough to read the difference. She let herself sleep. She woke to Nathan speaking quietly, and Eli's voice answering him, and the particular domestic quality of morning in a small space, the sounds of someone tending a fire, of coffee being made in the way it gets made when someone is trying to make it without waking anyone, which is always recognizable because the attempt itself makes its own small sounds. She lay still for a moment without opening her eyes. The fever in her leg had been replaced weeks ago by the dull stiffness she now considered normal, and her back ached from the chair she'd slept in, and she was thirsty and needed the necessary and didn't want to move because the not moving was very fine. She could hear Eli's cough. It was still there, but it had changed again, come back up toward the surface, lost some of the deep wet quality that had frightened her in the night. Not gone, but better in the way that actually meant better, not the way that was just hoping. "She's awake," Eli said. She hadn't moved, but children notice things by triangulation, a change in breathing, something in the quality of stillness. She opened her eyes. Nathan was crouching by the fire with the coffee tin in his hand, and Eli was sitting up on the rope bed with his blankets around him, looking like something that had been through a difficult night but had opinions about making the best of the morning. His color was better. Not right, not fully, but the gray undertone she'd noticed yesterday was less pronounced. Nathan looked at her. "Coffee's made." "I know. I smelled it 20 minutes ago." Something that was very nearly a smile happened at the corner of his mouth. "Why didn't you get up?" "I was conducting a strategic assessment." Eli made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough, and turned out to be both. She got up. Her back stated its objections. She ignored them and went to the window and looked out. The snow had stopped. The sky was the hard, clear blue of a frontier morning after a storm has passed through and left everything clean and cold and utterly indifferent to the preferences of the people underneath it. The lean-to was buried on one side and the wagons were rounded shapes in the white, but the spruce trees had held, and the trail, what she could see of it, was passable if they were prepared to work for it. She turned from the window. "Eli," she said, "how do you feel?" He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "Hungry." "Before hungry?" "Better," he said, and this time it carried the quality of something true. She looked at Nathan. I was already looking at her. The pass was still ahead. The filing deadline was still counting. Harmon's man was still at the territorial office, sitting in a chair somewhere filing his nails or counting money or doing whatever men did while waiting to take what didn't belong to them. But Eli's fever was down, and the storm was spent, and the coffee was made, and they were all three of them on the right side of the night they'd come through. She took the cup Nathan held out to her. "How many days to the pass?" she said. "2. Maybe 2.5 if Eli needs to take it slow." "We take it at whatever pace Eli needs." Nathan looked at her. The morning light came through the small window and lay flat and cold across the cabin floor between them. "All right," he said. She drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly burned, the way trail coffee always was, and she drank it standing at the window, looking at the pass that was still up there waiting for them, and she thought, "We have come through worse than what's left. All three of us, together, have come through worse." She thought it without flinching and without examining the word together too carefully, and that was progress of a kind she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized as real. They took the pass on the third day after the storm, when Eli's cough had thinned to something manageable, and the boy could sit upright on the wagon bench without listing to one side. The approach to the high pass was 3 miles of trail that climbed steadily through thinning pine and then broke above the tree line entirely, leaving them exposed to a sky so large and cold it felt less like weather and more like a condition of the universe. The wind up there had opinions about every loose thing: canvas edges, coat hems, the brim of Evelyn's hat, which she anchored with one hand for the first mile until she found a piece of rope in the wagon box and tied it properly. Below them, the valley they'd come through looked small and comprehensible, which was the particular trick altitude played on you, making the hard things look manageable from above because you could see the whole of them. Nathan had ridden ahead to check the surface and came back with a report that was neither good nor bad. The upper face had wind crust, solid enough to bear the wagon wheels if they moved steadily and didn't stop on the exposed section, and there were 2 places where drifting had narrowed the trail to something that would need careful management. He said all of this with the same factual quality he brought to most things, and Evelyn received it the same way, and they moved. Eli sat between them on the bench of Nathan's wagon for the crossing, which was a departure from their established arrangement and which nobody commented on. He was still pale, still carrying the chest cold and the occasional cough that surfaced every 30 minutes or so, and his presence between them on the high exposed face of a mountain pass. In early winter felt like something they were all three tacitly acknowledging needed protecting. The worst section was the western face. The trail cut along a sheer drop on the left side, maybe 200 feet down to a boulder field that winter had turned white but not soft. And the surface was exactly what Nathan had described: wind crust over packed snow, solid until it wasn't, and the wasn't was the part you couldn't predict. Biscuit didn't like it. He communicated this through a sideways pull on the reins, and a quality of attention that meant he was allocating his resources differently, which was the mule version of concern. Evelyn gave him the rope he needed and kept the pressure steady and talked to him in a low, continuous voice that wasn't words exactly, just sound, the way you'd steady any creature that needed steadying. They crossed in 40 minutes. The wagons came off the upper face and into the shelter of the eastern descent, and the wind dropped like a curtain falling, and all three of them exhaled in roughly the same moment, which would have been funny under different circumstances. "That's the last of the hard country," Nathan said. Evelyn looked back at the pass. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "Because every time someone says that, the country disagrees." He looked at the pass, looked at her. "Fair point." Eli coughed. "Boy." The eastern descent was gentler and the trail widened back to a proper two-wagon road within 2 miles of the pass, and by midday they were moving through country that had the feel of land that had seen regular human traffic. A cut stump here, an old fire ring there, the compressed earth of a trail that got used. Civilization was a relative term on the frontier, but they were within its relative orbit now, and Evelyn felt this as a specific change in the quality of her vigilance, a fractional loosening. She also felt the deadline: 3 weeks and 2 days. She'd stopped counting days and started counting days several times over the course of this journey, the arithmetic shifting every time weather or illness or terrain 8 hours she hadn't planned to spend. But 3 weeks and 2 days was still workable, provided the territorial office was reachable in under 2 weeks from their current position, which the survey map suggested was possible, and provided Harmon's filing agent hadn't managed to push the competing claim through before she could contest it in person, which was the variable she couldn't control and therefore tried not to spend too much energy on. She mentioned the timeline to Nathan that evening. He was quiet for a moment, doing his own version of the arithmetic. If the road holds, we can make the claim in 10 days. The filing office is another day past that. 11 days to file. She'd been hoping for 10. That's 2 weeks out, almost exactly. 1 week of margin. 1 week isn't margin, it's an invitation for something to go wrong. Something's been going wrong since Caldwell. He said it without irony. We've been managing it. She looked at the fire. This is different. Harmon's man has been there since before we left Harlow's Creek. He's had weeks to build whatever case he's building. A week isn't enough to dismantle something that's been constructed carefully. What do you need? I need to know what he filed, exactly, before I walk into that office. She'd been turning this over for days, in the background, behind the weather and the leg and Eli's fever. If I go in blind and he's filed on technical grounds, some deficiency in Clara's original homestead documentation, I can counter it if I know about it. If I don't know about it, I'm arguing against a document I haven't read. Nathan was looking at her with the focused attention he gave to problems worth solving. Is there someone at the territorial office who isn't Harmon's man? There are 3 clerks. I don't know which one he's working with. Then we find out before we get there. She looked at him. How? The settlement 2 days out from the filing office. Harlow's Creek proved that people in these settlements talk. Someone will know who Harmon's been paying and what they've been filing. We go in with information instead of without it. She considered this. It added no time, like they'd pass through that settlement regardless. It required trusting that the right person in the settlement would know the right thing and be willing to say it, which was not a certainty but was a better probability than going in blind. That's a good plan, she said. He looked faintly surprised that she'd said it directly. You don't have to sound shocked. I'm not shocked. I'm acknowledging when something is good. She looked at the fire. I do that. I've noticed you're more likely to acknowledge a good plan than a good intention. She thought about this. Plans are verifiable, she said. Intentions are what people tell you about themselves. I was quiet for a moment. What do my intentions look like from where you're sitting? It was a direct question. She'd come to understand that this was his preferred mode, not circling toward a thing but going at it, which had the effect of making evasion more difficult because there was nothing to evade around. Honest, she said, which is not the same as uncomplicated. No, he agreed. It's not. They sat with that for a moment. Nathan. She said his name and then paused, which was unusual for her. She didn't generally start sentences and then stop. What happens when we reach the filing office? He looked at her. He understood she wasn't asking about logistics. That depends on you, he said. Partly. And the other part? The other part is what I want. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, which is that we don't separate once the filing's done, that Eli and I don't continue west to my brother-in-law's mill while you stay on Clara's claim alone. She looked at the fire. You haven't seen the claim, she said. You don't know what it is. I know enough. It might be barely survivable. Clara's letters were, she was optimistic about things. She always was. The cabin might be in worse shape than she let on. The south field might be... Evelyn. He waited. She looked at him. I'm not offering to evaluate a property. I'm telling you I don't want to take Eli West to someone else's life when we have the materials for our own right here. The fire cracked once, loudly, and sent a brief column of sparks up into the dark. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of everything she'd told herself since Robert, the entire scaffolding of it, the careful architecture of a life that didn't require anyone to stay. She was aware of it, the way you're aware of a structure when you're standing outside it and looking at it from a new angle for the first time. I'm not easy to live with, she said. I know that. You've known me 3 weeks. 3 weeks of trail in winter is about 4 months of ordinary time. He looked at the fire. I know you well enough. You know me in a crisis. That's not nothing. That's maybe the most important version of a person there is. She didn't answer right away. She was turning this over, not looking for the flaw in it, but genuinely considering it, which was different. Ask me again, she said finally. When the filing's done and Clara's land is settled, Ask me when I'm not standing in the middle of the thing and can see both sides of it. He held her gaze. All right, he said, not disappointed, not negotiating, just accepting the terms she'd offered, which were honest terms, and that was enough. Ely was better by the fourth day down from the pass, which meant he was present in the full sense again, curious, occasionally vocal about his opinions, and prone to the particular kind of question that children ask when they've been too sick to ask questions for a while and have a backlog. He asked Evelyn about Clara. Not that morning. It came on the afternoon of the fourth day when they were moving through country that had begun to look like what Clara's letters had described, the long grassy corridors between stands of pine, the creak sound she could hear before she could see, the quality of the light in the late afternoon coming in flat and golden off the snow. Did she look like you? Eli asked. Evelyn kept her eyes on the trail. She had lighter hair, lighter than mine. She was shorter. Were you friends? She was my sister. That's not the same thing. She glanced at him. He was sitting with his knees up on the wagon bench, looking at the country ahead, and the question wasn't unkind. It was the guileless precision of a child who has understood something adults usually paper over. You're right, she said. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. We were different enough that being friends took work. We did the work. Better in letters than in person, honestly. Some people are like that. She paused. When she was dying, she sent for her husband's sister, not for me. I don't know why. By the time I heard, it was already over. Eli was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. So am I, she said, and meant it in more directions than she'd been meaning it for the past several years. Sorry for the distance. Sorry for the letters that came too slowly. Sorry for the specific version of strength she'd practiced that looked like self-sufficiency and was sometimes just avoidance. Pa says grief is how you know something mattered, Eli said. She looked at him. Your pa says useful things. Mostly. He shifted position. Sometimes he says things that are just him talking because he's worried and doesn't want to show it. What does that sound like? Eli thought about it. Like explaining what we already know. He'll say the road is going to be long, and we need to be prepared and check the animals twice, and really what he means is he's scared something's going to go wrong. She looked ahead at the trail. That sounds familiar? Eli glanced at her. You do it too. Do I? You talk about the deadline and the filing office and Harmon's man a lot when you're not sure about something that isn't about any of those things. She looked at the boy. He met her gaze with the calm forthrightness of someone who'd said a true thing and was waiting to see how it landed. You're observant, she said. Pa says it skips a generation. Despite everything, she laughed. It came out shorter than a real laugh. She was out of practice. But it was real, and Eli heard it and looked satisfied in the way of someone who has accomplished a thing they set out to accomplish. They reached Clara's claim on a morning that was clear and painfully cold, the kind of cold that had no cruelty in it, just indifference, the Frontier's standard operating mode. She recognized it before she saw the cabin. The creak sound first, exactly as Clara had described, a particular note that the cold had lowered but not silenced, and then the shape of the land, the way the south field opened up beyond the tree line with a quality of space that Clara's letters had tried to capture and partially succeeded. The cabin was there. Small. Real. The east-facing window Clara had written about caught the morning light the way Clara had said it would. Evelyn stopped the wagon. Nathan came up beside her and stopped too, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The cabin was in decent shape. Not perfect. One section of roof had sunk where a rafter had failed, and there was work to be done on the south wall where winter had gotten into the chinking. But the structure was sound, and the stone chimney was intact, and Clara's kitchen garden, visible at the south corner under its covering of snow, was outlined in the careful way of someone who had planned it to last. She got down from the wagon. Her leg barely registered the cold anymore. The infection was a month behind her, and what remained was a scar that would ache in winter for the rest of her life, and had already become simply part of the inventory of herself. She walked to the cabin door. The latch was the kind Clara had described in a letter the previous spring, a wooden pivot mechanism that she'd made herself from a piece of ash wood. Evelyn put her hand on it and stood there for a moment with her palm flat on the cold wood. Then she lifted the latch and went inside. It smelled like cedar and cold ash and something that was almost recognizable, some quality that might have been Clara's presence, or might have been Evelyn's memory of it, or might have been the same thing stated differently. The single room was tidy in the way of a person who believed in tidiness as a form of respect for a space. The rope bed had a quilt on it, folded. The table had 2 chairs. On the shelf above the hearth were 3 books, a tin candle holder, and a small ceramic jar with a lid that Evelyn crossed the room to look at. Inside the jar, folded twice, was a piece of paper. She unfolded it. It was Clara's handwriting. The date at the top was late August, 3 weeks before Clara died. "Evelyn," it began, "if you're reading this, you came, which means I was right to write it down. The deed is in the box under the bed. The filing documentation is with it, all 4 years of it. I kept everything because I had a feeling keeping everything would matter someday. The south field has good grass if you clear the north corner. The creek doesn't freeze hard enough to close, not even in February. There's a neighbor 3 miles east, Mrs. Aldred, who will help if you ask her. You might have to ask twice. I know you." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood in the middle of Clara's cabin for a moment with her hand pressed flat against her sternum. She didn't cry. She was aware of the pressure behind her eyes that was adjacent to crying, and she breathed through it, once, twice, and then she went to the box under the bed and took out the deed and the 4 years of meticulous filing documentation that Clara had kept in a wrapped oilcloth packet. Every receipt, every filing date, every witness signature. More documentation than any land office clerk could argue against if it was presented correctly. She carried it outside. Nathan was standing at the wagon. Eli was crouching at the creek's edge, looking into the water where it ran clear over the stones, even in the cold, that particular absorbed interest of a child confronting something elemental. She held up the oilcloth packet. Nathan's expression registered, went through something, settled. She kept everything. Everything. Evelyn's voice was level. 4 years. She knew someone might try this. He was quiet for a moment. It changes the timeline. It changes more than the timeline. She looked at the packet. With this documentation, the territorial judge doesn't have to weigh competing claims. He just has to read what's already on record. She looked at Nathan. Harmon's man never had a case. He was counting on the fact that Clara's heir would either not come or come without evidence. The relief she felt was not the warm, uncomplicated kind. It had Clara's August handwriting in it, and 4 years of solitary work, and the specific loneliness of a woman who'd planned for her own death, with enough care to leave a letter in a jar on a shelf for a sister who might come. "We need to get to the filing office," she said, "before Harmon figures out we're here." 2 days. 1.5 if we move tomorrow morning. He nodded, looked at the cabin. Tonight here, she agreed. She looked at the east window, catching the morning light. "She was right about the window," she said. Nathan looked at it. "What?" "In her letters. She said the morning light through the east window was the best thing about the place." She looked at it for a moment longer. She was right. They worked that afternoon, Nathan on the failed rafter, while there was still daylight to work by, Evelyn on the south wall, chinking with a material she mixed from what she found in Clara's supply box, Eli carrying and fetching with the diligent purposefulness that had become his default contribution. The work was necessary and good, and she threw herself into it the way she threw herself into things that required her hands and her attention and left less room for the other kind of thinking. By late afternoon, the roof section was braced and the worst of the wall gaps were filled and the cabin was warmer than it had been that morning. Nathan built a fire in Clara's hearth and the chimney drew cleanly, which was one more thing Clara had maintained properly. They ate from their trail supplies because there was nothing else, but they ate inside, at Clara's table, with the fire going and the east window dark now with early December evening. It was the first time in 3 weeks they'd eaten inside at a real table, and the difference was not small. Eli noticed it immediately and commented on it the way children comment on things adults have learned to take for granted, directly and with appropriate wonder. "This is better," he said. "Tables are better." "They are," Nathan said. Evelyn looked at the table. At the 2 chairs that Clara had put there, which now had 3 people at them with Eli on an upturned crate Nathan had found in the lean-to. 3 chairs. That was the next thing to make, once the filing was done. A 3rd chair for Clara's table. She thought about this with a specificity that surprised her. The measurement of it, the wood, the joints, and understood it was the first time she'd thought about what came after in terms of objects rather than abstractions. After supper. Eli fell asleep on Clara's rope bed with Clara's folded quilt half opened over him, which felt less like an intrusion and more like the space being used the way spaces are meant to be used, and Nathan sat by the fire and she sat across from him and the evening settled around them. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he confirmed. She looked at her hands, at the oilcloth packet on the table beside her. If Harmon's man has already pushed the claim through, if the clerk processed it before we can contest, the documentation supersedes a contested filing. Any judge will see that. If we get the right judge, we work with whoever we get. He said it with the calm of someone who has accepted that some variables aren't controllable and has made his peace with that. "Evelyn, you've got 4 years of Clara's records and your own name on a legal deed. What Harmon has is a filing agent and a clerk who took his money. That's not the same category of evidence." She knew this. She'd known it since she'd read the packet's contents. But knowing it and believing it were separated by the distance between logic and experience, and her experience had shown her enough times that the worse argument won when the worse argument had more resources behind it. "What if they make it expensive to contest?" she said. "Legal fees, delays. Then we make it more expensive for them to continue." He held her gaze. "You're not doing this alone anymore. I want you to remember that before you walk into that office." She looked at him. She thought about the rope in her hands on a blizzard night, the tension of it, the language of two people communicating through a line in the dark. "I remember," she said. He looked at the fire for a moment. "There's something I want to say." She waited. "When this is done, the filing, the deed, all of it, I'm not going to my brother-in-law's mill." He said it without drama, which was the only way it could be said properly. "I wrote him last month when we were in Harlow's Creek. Told him I'd found different circumstances." She was very still. "You wrote him before I said anything," she said. "I wrote him when I understood what I was looking at." He looked at her with the directness that she'd stopped flinching from somewhere around the second week. "I told you to ask me again when the filing was done. I'm not asking yet. I'm just telling you that the decision is already made on my end, so when you're making yours, you know what's on the table." The fire was warm. The east window was dark. Eli's breathing was the slow, even rhythm of a child sleeping deeply for the first time in days. She thought about what she'd told him on the trail. "Ask me when I can see both sides of it." She could see both sides of it now. She'd been able to see both sides of it for longer than she'd admitted. What she'd been doing, what she recognized now with the clarity that comes from the inside of a cabin with a fire going and 4 years of a dead sister's careful record-keeping on the table, was not thinking. She'd been waiting to see if something went wrong, if the shape of what was being offered would reveal itself to be what she'd been given before and had paid dearly for. It hadn't. It wasn't. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, after the filing. Something in his expression. Not relief. Not quite. But the neighbor of it. "Tomorrow," he said. She looked at the table, at the spot where a third chair would go, at the east-facing window that would catch the morning light in about 7 hours. "Clara would have liked you," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. He looked at her. "Yeah?" She liked practical people who didn't fuss. She paused. She liked people who showed up. He was quiet for a moment. She raised someone worth showing up for. Evelyn looked at the fire, and this time she didn't push the feeling down or examine it for hidden costs or hold it at the length of careful consideration. She let it be what it was. Outside, the creek ran under the first skin of ice. The cold had laid across its edges, and the stars above the frontier were the hard, brilliant stars of a clear December night. And inside Clara's cabin, the fire burned with the unhurried patience of a thing that has enough fuel and know where it needs to be. They left Clara's cabin before first light. Not because the deadline required it. They had a day and a half of margin, which wasn't comfort but was workable. But because Evelyn woke at 4 in the morning with the particular alertness that meant her mind had been working while she slept and had arrived at something. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to the cabin settle in the cold, to Eli's even breathing on the rope bed, to the creek outside doing its quiet winter business. And then she got up and started the fire and put the coffee on and sat at Clara's table with the oilcloth packet open in front of her. She went through every document in it, again, By firelight, slowly, the way you read something when you're looking not for what's there but for what might be missing, the gap that an opposing argument could fit itself into. Clara's homestead filings were meticulous. 4 years of quarterly reports, witness signatures, improvement records, tax receipts. The original deed with the land office stamp. 2 letters from the territorial office acknowledging receipt of annual documentation, which were the kind of letters bureaucracies send when they don't intend them to matter, and which turn out to matter enormously later. There was one gap. A 6-week period in the second year where the quarterly report was missing. Not the receipt, Bob. The underlying report itself. The receipt acknowledged it had been filed, but the document wasn't in the packet. Evelyn sat with this for a long time. Nathan woke when the coffee was ready, the way men wake when they've been traveling long enough that their sleep becomes calibrated to useful intervals. He came to the table, saw her face, and sat down without speaking. She slid the packet across and pointed to the gap. He looked at it. Receipt's there. Report isn't. The receipt proves it was filed. A receipt proves a document was received. A good lawyer argues it doesn't prove the document's content, that the underlying report could have been deficient, that without the original we can't verify the improvement record was accurate for that quarter. He was quiet. Would that be enough to overturn 4 years of clean documentation? On its own, no. But it's a foothold. If Harmon's man has been in that office long enough to review the filing history, and he's had weeks, he's already found it. She looked at the gap in the record. He'll use it not to win outright, but to create enough uncertainty that the clerk refers the case to a review board instead of ruling immediately. Review boards take months. After 3 months, Harmon files for provisional occupancy, and then the land is effectively his while the board deliberates. Nathan looked at her. What do we do? We get in front of it. She was already folding the documents back into their sequence. We walk in knowing about the gap before he brings it up. We have the receipt. We have the 4 years of context around it. We ask the judge, not the clerk. We go straight to the judge to rule on the totality of the record rather than any single document. Can we do that? Go straight to the judge? Clara's original filing included a notation requesting territorial judicial review in case of any dispute. It's on the deed. She tapped the page. She put it there deliberately. She was smarter about this than anyone gave her credit for. Nathan looked at the deed. At the small notation in Clara's careful handwriting, 3 lines at the bottom of the document that could easily be overlooked and had clearly been overlooked by Harmon's man, or he would have tried to have it expunged already. She was protecting you, he said. She did this before she died knowing you'd come. Evelyn looked at the notation. She'd read it twice the night before, and both times she'd had to stop and breathe. And this morning she looked at it with the steadiness she'd had to rebuild, the kind that's not the absence of feeling but the ability to carry feeling without putting it down. She was protecting what she built, Evelyn said, and she knew I'd understand the documentation better than anyone. She closed the packet. She looked at Nathan. We need to move, she said. The territorial filing office for the district was in a settlement called Granger's Ford, which was larger than Harlow's Creek, but only in the way that one difficult thing can be larger than another difficult thing without either of them being good. It had a main street of a dozen buildings, 2 of which were saloons, one of which was the combined land office and territorial courthouse that served a region roughly the size of a small eastern state. They arrived in the early afternoon of the following day, having pushed hard through the morning, Eli well enough to drive his father's wagon for an hour on the flat ground south of town, while Nathan rode ahead. The boy handled it with the focus of someone given a real responsibility, both hands on the reins, watching the road the way his father had taught him. And when Nathan came back and took the reins again, Eli moved over without complaint, which was its own form of maturity. The land office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story stone building, solid in the way of things built to last past the people who built them. 2 horses were tied at the rail outside. One of them was better kept than a government horse had any business being, groomed, well shod, with a saddle that cost money. Evelyn looked at it when they pulled up. Harmon's man, she said. Nathan looked at the horse. Or someone who spends Harmon's money. They left the wagons at the livery 3 buildings down and walked to the land office, Eli between them. Evelyn carried the oilcloth packet inside her coat. She'd been aware of it against her ribs all morning the way you're aware of something important. Not constantly, but reliably, whenever she shifted position. Inside was warm and smelled of paper and lamp oil, and the particular exhausted smell of a room where people came to argue about things they cared about too much. 2 rows of benches along the walls. A long counter at the far end with 2 clerks behind it. A closed door to the left marked Judge W. Calhoun. Territorial Court, in letters that had been painted with care by someone who understood the importance of legibility. Sitting on the end bench to the right was a man who looked at them the way a man looks at a problem. He'd been told was theoretical, and has just discovered is actual. He was well-dressed for the frontier, not city-dressed, but the kind of deliberate middle ground that meant he knew how to present himself to rural officials without alienating them. He was perhaps 45, with the careful eyes of someone whose profession was finding gaps in other people's paperwork. He looked at Evelyn specifically, at the packet-shaped outline under her coat. She looked back at him without expression and walked to the counter. The clerk was young, with the slightly defensive posture of someone who has been in a difficult position for long enough that it started to feel normal. "I need to see Judge Calhoun," Evelyn said. "Clara Hartwell, homestead filing, original deed number 4471. There's a notation on the deed requesting judicial review in case of dispute." The clerk looked at her. "The judge is, I know there's a competing claim filed by Harmon Land and Cattle." She said it before he could say it. "I know it was filed 3 weeks ago. I'm the legal next of kin, and I have 4 years of homestead documentation. The deed notation gives me the right to territorial judicial review before any competing claim is processed." She set the deed on the counter so he could see the notation. "I'm invoking that right." The clerk read the notation. He read it twice. He glanced at the man on the bench, the only acknowledgement he'd given that the man existed, and then he looked back at Evelyn, and he understood, in the way people in his position understand things, that this had become a different kind of situation than the one he'd been managing. "I'll tell the judge you're here," he said. They waited 40 minutes on the benches. Harmon's man, whose name was Prescott, which Evelyn had gotten from the clerk's brief and involuntary glance at a file folder, sat on his bench and occasionally looked at Evelyn with the calculating patience of someone rearranging his approach. He didn't speak to them. She didn't speak to him. Nathan sat to her left with his forearms on his knees, alert in the way he was alert on the trail when something hadn't happened yet but was going to. And Eli sat to her right and read the adventure book, or appeared to, the volume held up in a way that allowed him to watch the room over the top of it. She thought, not for the first time, that this child was going to be formidable when he was grown. Judge Wallace Calhoun was 60 years old, built like a man who had done physical work for the first half of his life and administrative work for the second half, and hadn't entirely relinquished the physical half. He had a gray beard and the reading glasses of a man who resented needing them and wore them anyway because accuracy mattered more than appearance. He came out of his office rather than summoning them in, which Evelyn took as information about how he operated. He looked at the room, at Evelyn, at Nathan, at Eli with his book, at Prescott on his bench. "Miss Mercer," he said. He'd been briefed by the clerk. "Mr. Prescott." He did not invite anyone to sit because they were already sitting. He pulled a chair from behind the counter and sat himself, which put him at eye level with everyone and at the center of the room. "I've read the Hartwell deed. The notation is valid. We'll proceed by those terms." He looked at Prescott, "Which means Harmon Land and Cattle's competing claim does not advance to processing until I've reviewed Miss Mercer's documentation and heard both positions. Clear?" Prescott's expression adjusted without changing. "Understood, Your Honor." Calhoun looked at Evelyn. "Let's see what you brought." Oh. She laid it out on the counter because the counter was the largest flat surface available, and the judge had moved his chair to face it. She went through the documents in chronological order, not rushing, not editorializing. Just the sequence of 4 years as Clara had maintained it, clean and factual and complete. Each quarterly report with its improvement records and witness signatures. Each tax receipt. The original deed with its land office stamp and the notation at the bottom. The 2 acknowledgement letters from the territorial office. Calhoun read. He was a slow reader in the way that means thorough rather than struggling, running his finger along each line with the reading glasses perched exactly where he'd put them, not adjusting them. Prescott sat forward on his bench. Evelyn watched the judge reach the second-year section. She held herself very still. Calhoun stopped, looked at the gap. looked at the receipt that acknowledged the missing report. He looked up at Evelyn over his glasses. "Second year, third quarter," he said. "Report's missing." "Receipt confirms it was filed," she said. "The document itself isn't in the packet. I believe it's in the Territorial Office's own archive, where it was submitted. The receipt is the office's acknowledgement of receipt, which means if the document is missing, it was lost on the office's side, not the filer's." Prescott spoke from the bench. "Or it was never filed and the receipt was issued in error. Which happens?" "Clerical." "Mr. Prescott," Calhoun said without looking up, "you'll speak when I ask you to speak." Prescott closed his mouth. Calhoun looked at the receipt. He looked at the sequence around it. The second year first quarter report, meticulous, followed by the gap, followed by the second year fourth quarter report, equally meticulous, the improvement records consistent across the whole span. "If the report was never filed," Calhoun said, more to himself than to the room, "the documentation on either side of the gap would likely show discontinuity. The improvement records for the surrounding quarters would be inconsistent with an operation that had gone undocumented for 6 weeks." He tapped the fourth quarter report. "These numbers are continuous with the first quarter. Fence line extended by 40 feet. Creek access improved, consistent with ongoing occupation." He looked at Evelyn. "Your sister lived on this land continuously." "For 4 years," Evelyn said. "She never left it for more than 3 days at a stretch. Her neighbor, Mrs. Aldred, 3 miles east, can testify to that." "I'll want Mrs. Aldred's statement." He made a note. "I'll also want the Territorial Archive searched for the missing report. If it's there, that closes the question." He looked at Prescott now. "What does Harmon Land and Cattle's filing rest on?" Prescott stood. He was composed, which Evelyn recognized as the composure of someone who had prepared for one version of this conversation and was adapting to a different one in real time. "Your Honor, the competing claim rests on the contention that the Hartwell homestead was abandoned following the occupant's death, with no next of kin filing within the statutory 90-day window, and that the documentation record contains an unresolvable gap that calls into question continuous occupancy." "The statutory window closes in 11 days, Calhoun said. "Yes, Your Honor. However, Harmon Land and Cattle filed for advance processing on the grounds that no next of kin had appeared. Next of kin is standing in my land office," Calhoun said, "with documentation." A silence. Calhoun looked back at the packet. He looked at it for a long time. The way a man looks at something when he's making a decision he wants to make correctly because he'll have to live with it. Then he looked up. "The competing claim filed by Harmon Land and Cattle is suspended pending archive review and witness statement." He took off his glasses. "Miss Mercer, the statutory window gives you 11 days. I'll have the archive search completed in 2. If the report is found, and based on what I'm looking at, I believe it will be, I'll process the title transfer to you as Clara Hartwell's legal next of kin within the week." He looked at her directly. "Your sister kept good records. That matters in this office." Evelyn looked at the judge. "It should matter everywhere," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "It should," he agreed. Prescott picked up his hat from the bench. He didn't say anything else. He walked to the door with the measured pace of someone who is controlling their exit carefully, and he went out, and the door closed behind him with the particular flatness of a man who has nothing dramatic left to offer. Calhoun stood and returned his chair to its place behind the counter. 2 days, he said. "Don't go far." They stayed at the boarding house above the saloon that did double duty as the settlement's only lodging, which cost more than it should have and was less comfortable than Clara's cabin, and was nevertheless the finest thing any of them had slept in for 6 weeks, according to Eli, who assessed the mattress by sitting on it several times and announced his verdict formally. Nathan paid for 2 rooms. Evelyn started to argue, and he looked at her with the look that meant this particular argument was one she wasn't going to win because he'd already done the thing, and she accepted this with the compressed expression of a woman filing the argument away for a more winnable occasion. That evening they ate at the saloon's dining table, actual food served by an actual person who brought it from a kitchen. Evelyn didn't have to manage, and the 3 of them ate in the particular silence of people who have been through enough together that silence is comfortable, punctuated by Eli's observations about the food, which were detailed and mostly positive. After Eli was asleep, Nathan knocked on the door of her room. She opened it. He was standing in the hallway with his coat still on, which meant he wasn't planning to stay, and he had the expression of a man who has decided to say a thing and is going to say it properly. "I told you I'd ask after the filing," he said. She looked at him. "It's not done yet, 2 days. The outcome's decided. Calhoun as much as said it." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking about the land, Evelyn. I'm asking about what comes after it." She leaned against the doorframe. She was tired in a bone-level way that wasn't unpleasant, the tiredness of a thing that has been carried a long distance and set down. "You want to stay on the claim," she said. "I want to build something on the claim. With you." He said it straight, the way he said everything. "I want Eli to grow up in a place that's ours, not someone else's arrangement. I want the Southfield Clara planted worked properly. I want—" He stopped. "I'm saying this badly. You're saying it fine. I don't have a lot to offer. The money from my Missouri property is mostly gone. I have tools, and I have skills, and I have Eli, who is an asset in the long run, even if the short run is expensive." Despite everything, despite the weariness and the weight of the past weeks, and the emotion she'd been holding at careful distance all day since standing in that land office, she felt something release in her chest that had been held for a very long time. "I know what you have," she said. "Then you know it's not much." "Nathan." She waited until he looked at her. "I've had much. It cost me everything I owned and 5 years to recover. What you have is what I'd have picked if I'd known what to pick." She held his gaze. "Yes." He was very still for a moment. "Yes to what specifically?" he said, not pressing, making sure. "Yes to staying. Yes to building." She looked at him. "Yes to whatever question you're working up to asking properly when you find the right moment." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled, not into happiness exactly. Happiness was too light a word for what was in his expression, which was the deeper, quieter thing that comes from understanding that something lost might not be permanently lost, that the country after grief can be real country and not just absence of the other kind. "The right moment might be soon," he said. "I'll be available," she said. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night." She closed the door and stood with her back against it and looked at the ceiling of the small boarding house room and breathed in and breathed out and let the feeling be what it was, all of it, without quartering it or examining it for costs. Calhoun's clerk found the missing report in the archive on the second day, exactly where it should have been, misfiled between 2 unrelated documents from the same quarter, the kind of clerical error that happens in every office where people are underpaid and overworked. The report was complete, accurate, and entirely consistent with the records surrounding it. Clara's improvement record for the second-year third quarter showed 40 feet of fence repaired, the creek access cleared of fallen timber, and the first plantings in what would become the kitchen garden. Calhoun processed the title transfer on the 4th day. Evelyn stood at the counter and watched him sign the document and stamp it, and she signed where indicated, and the land office clerk witnessed it, and when it was done, the judge slid the document across the counter to her and said, "The Hartwell claim is yours, Miss Mercer, recorded and sealed." She picked it up. It didn't feel like anything in particular. That was the truth of it. After the weeks and the miles and the leg and the storm and Eli's fever and the blizzard night with the rope in her hands, the moment of the thing itself felt smaller than it should have. A piece of paper, a stamp, a clerk's signature. But on the other side of it was Clara's east-facing window, and the creek that didn't freeze hard in February, and the kitchen garden that needed its north corner cleared, and Evelyn understood that the piece of paper wasn't the thing. It was the door to the thing, and the thing itself was still there, waiting, the way good things wait when they're built on solid ground. She folded the document and put it in her coat. Nathan was standing behind her. She turned and he saw her face and read it correctly, the way he read most things correctly now. And he put his hand briefly on her arm, and that was the right amount of it. They walked out of the land office together into the cold December morning. Prescott was at the rail outside. Still there, or back? She didn't know which. He was mounted now, and he looked down at her from the saddle with an expression that had moved past the professional composure of 2 days ago into something more personal and less managed. "Harmon will contest the transfer," he said. "You know that." "He can contest it," she said. "He'll lose." She met his gaze. "The documentation is complete. The archive report was found. The judge has signed. Any contest goes to the Territorial Circuit Court. where the evidence is the same evidence that just closed this case. She held his gaze. Tell Harmon to look at the other claims on his list. Clara Hartwell's land isn't available. Prescott looked at her for a moment. He was smart enough to know when a position had become untenable. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes, the assessment of what a prolonged contest would cost against what it would yield. This isn't finished, he said. The last tool of a man who has no more tools. It is for me, she said. Good day, Mr. Prescott. She walked past him to where Nathan and Eli stood with the wagons at the livery, and she didn't look back, and she heard Prescott's horse move off down the street and kept walking up. They returned to Clara's claim on a day that was cold and clear and smelled of pine resin and creek water and the particular clean emptiness of frontier air in December. The cabin looked the same as it had 3 days ago. Same failed rafter braced by Nathan's repair, same snow-covered kitchen garden outlined at the south corner. But it looked different too, in the way a place looks different once it's yours and you know it. Mrs. Aldred came the second day, which meant word had traveled the 3 miles from her homestead with the efficiency of frontier communication, which was neighbor to neighbor and moved faster than most people expected. She was a small, sharp-faced woman of perhaps 60 who arrived on a sturdy horse with a covered basket over one arm and the expression of someone who had decided to take the measure of a situation and had not yet decided what she thought. She looked at Evelyn, she looked at Nathan, she looked at Eli, who was chopping kindling with a small hatchet and the concentrated effort of a child performing a useful task for an audience. You're Clara's sister, she said to Evelyn. I am. You look like her around the eyes. She talked about you. Good things, I hope. Honest things, Mrs. Aldred said, which was a more interesting answer. She said you were the practical one. Said if anything happened to her, you'd come and you'd figure it out, and you wouldn't need anyone to hold your hand doing it. She glanced at Nathan. Looks like she was mostly right. Evelyn looked at Nathan. He was carrying a log to the woodpile and appeared to be concentrating on the log. She was right about the figuring out, Evelyn said. She underestimated what it takes to get here. Mrs. Aldred set her basket on the ground and opened it. A covered pot and 2 jars and a package wrapped in cloth that turned out to be bread. She kept everything properly, she said, the records. I signed witness papers for her every quarter. She said it was important. A pause. Harmon took the Sanderson claim last spring. People around here know what he does. He won't get this one, Evelyn said. The woman looked at her for a moment. She had the eyes of someone who had been on the frontier long enough to measure a person by different instruments than most people used. No, she said. I don't think he will. She stayed for 2 hours. She told Evelyn about the South Field, the specific characteristics of its soil, the variety of grass that came up in spring. She told her about the creek's behavior across the seasons in detail that matched and exceeded Clara's letters. She told her which of the other neighbors could be trusted and which couldn't, and which one had a draft horse available for hire in spring if the plowing needed doing. Before she left, she looked at Eli, who was sitting on an upturned crate outside the cabin door in the last of the afternoon light, still with his adventure book, the hatchet leaned against the wall beside him. Good boy, she said. Not to Eli, to Nathan, the way people say things about children when they mean them for the parent. Nathan accepted this with a nod that meant he understood what she'd actually said. After she rode away, Nathan and Evelyn stood outside the cabin in the cold, with the thin afternoon light going and the creek audible, and the smoke from the chimney going straight up in the still air, the way chimney smoke goes when the weather is settled. She'll be useful, Nathan said. She'll be honest, Evelyn said. Which is better? He looked at her. Are you happy? The question sat there, simple and large. She thought about what happy meant. Not the word, but the actual state of it, what it felt like, and whether it was the right word for what she felt standing on Clara's land with the deed in her pocket, and the winter coming in honestly, and the people she hadn't expected standing beside her. I'm not unhappy, she said, which is further from unhappy than I've been in a long time. That's a start, he said. It's a good start, she said. Oh. He asked her on a Sunday, which she knew was Sunday only because Eli had announced it with the authority of someone keeping careful count. They were inside, the 3 of them, Eli with his book and Nathan doing something to the chair leg he'd been meaning to fix, and Evelyn reading Clara's letters again. Not all of them, just the ones from the last year, reading them differently now that she was here, in the place the letters came from. He set down the chair. He looked at her across the small room. Evelyn. She looked up from the letters. He was not a man who got down on one knee. She would not have wanted him to. It would have been the wrong kind of ceremony for what they were, which was two people who had come through difficult things together and understood each other at the kind of depth that only difficult things reveal. He just looked at her with the directness he'd had from the beginning, the quality that had frightened her at first, and which she now understood as the rarest form of respect, the refusal to dress up a true thing in performance. "Will you marry me?" he said. Eli had looked up from his book. He held it open, but he wasn't reading. He was watching with the full attention of someone for whom the answer to this question mattered in ways too large and too long to fully understand yet, but understood enough. She looked at Nathan. She looked at Eli. She looked at the letters in her hand, Clara's words about the creek and the window, and the neighbor who would help if you asked twice, the careful record of a woman who had built something real and had left it for someone she trusted to build more. "Yes," she said. Eli exhaled, which was the most honest response in the room. Nathan looked at her for a moment with that settled, quiet thing in his expression that wasn't happiness exactly, but was the thing underneath happiness, the ground it grows in. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. Eli went back to his book, or appeared to. His ears were still very much in the conversation. They married in February in the land office at Granger's Ford because it was the most official building available, and Evelyn had no interest in ceremony for its own sake, only in the legal fact of it, which was the practical version of the same impulse that had brought her across the frontier in winter. The understanding that what matters should be documented, that the things worth having are worth making real on paper as well as in the world. Judge Calhoun performed the ceremony, which he did with the same directness he brought to land disputes. No embellishment, no excess, just the words that needed to be said plainly and correctly. Mrs. Aldred stood as witness. Eli stood beside his father and held himself very straight, which was his version of ceremony. Evelyn wore her good coat, which was the best she had, and Nathan had shaved, and when Calhoun asked if she would take Nathan Cross as her husband, she said yes without hesitation and without qualification, and the word landed in the room cleanly, the way words land when they're true. Afterward, standing outside in the February cold, Mrs. Aldred pressed both of Evelyn's hands in hers and said, "Clara would be glad." Evelyn believed this, not as a comfort and not as a sentiment, but as a fact about her sister, who had been practical and who had understood that the point of building a thing was to have it lived in, and who had left a letter in a jar on a shelf just in case. Spring came to Clara's land in the slow, confident way of frontier spring, not arriving so much as asserting itself. A degree of warmth here and a week of clear sky there, the creek sound changing as the melt added to it. The kitchen garden's north corner got cleared in March, Evelyn and Nathan working opposite ends of it, Eli pulling the smaller debris to the pile they'd burn later. The ground underneath was better than Evelyn had expected. Clara had amended it, added material over the years, prepared it for someone else's use or her own extended use, whichever came. The south field was as good as Mrs. Aldred had said it was, better than the letters. The grass came up in April in the particular thick way of ground that has never been depleted, and Nathan stood at the field's edge looking at it with an expression that Evelyn had learned to read as the expression of a man counting what a thing is worth in practical terms and arriving at a number that satisfied him. He filed for homestead rights on the adjacent 40 acres to the east in April, which combined with Clara's claim gave them 120 acres of mixed field and timber and creek access, and a south field that could support cattle by the following year if they were strategic about it. Mrs. Aldred came to the filing with them, at Evelyn's request, and signed as witness again, which she did with the same competent brevity she brought to everything. Harmon's contest arrived in April. A letter from a territorial lawyer asserting procedural irregularities in Calhoun's processing of the title transfer. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table and made notes in the margins and wrote a response herself, citing chapter and section, attaching the relevant archive documents and copies she'd had made before leaving Granger's Ford, specifically because she'd anticipated this. And she mailed it back to the territorial lawyer with the composed certainty of someone who has done the arithmetic on a problem and knows what the number is. She never heard from Harmon's lawyer again. This was not a surprise. What surprised people about Harmon, she suspected, was not that he backed down, but that it took so little, that the whole edifice of what he'd built on the frontier corridor depended on people not pushing back, on widows and isolated settlers not knowing what they had the right to do or being too exhausted or too alone to do it. When someone pushed back with documentation and precision and the specific refusal to be worn down, there was not much underneath. She thought about the 7 claims he'd taken before Clara's, about the women and families who'd come through what she'd come through and not had a sister's careful records waiting for them. She wrote 3 letters, to the families whose names she'd gotten from the store owner in Harlow's Creek, from Mrs. Aldred, from a neighbor to the south who had his own grievance, explaining what documentation could accomplish, explaining the territorial notation provision, explaining that a judge like Calhoun would hear a case if the case was brought with evidence. She didn't know if the letters would matter. She sent them anyway. It was the thing she could do, so she did it. Nathan found her at the table one evening after the letters were sealed and asked what she was writing, and she told him. He looked at the stack of envelopes and then at her. Clara's record saved the claim, he said. Yes. These might save someone else's. That's the idea. He looked at her for a moment. You're going to do this again. Help someone else contest Harmon. If they need it. He nodded slowly. Not surprised. Not even specifically concerned. Just absorbing something about the person he'd married that he'd understood already but was seeing more clearly now. Then we'll need to keep better records of our own, he said, in case anyone needs a model to follow. She looked at him. This was what she'd been trying to say, without quite having the words for it, about the difference between practical people and people who just did what was in front of them. Nathan saw what a thing was for, not just immediately, not just for themselves, but in the larger sense. We keep everything, she said. We keep everything, he agreed. Eli turned 9 that summer, on a day that was warm enough to work outside without a coat, and Evelyn made the cake that Eli had described as the best possible cake. A simple molasses cake, nothing elaborate, which was his father's son in the dessert department, as in most things. Mrs. Aldred came, and 2 families from within 5 miles who had become the tentative beginning of the neighborhood that frontier settlements become when the right people stay long enough. Eli ate his cake with the focused appreciation of someone receiving exactly what they wanted, and then he went outside with the neighbor children and did whatever children do when they're released from adults, the sound of them going around the cabin and toward the creek, and Evelyn sat at Clara's table with the 3rd chair she'd made in January and listened to the sound of the cabin full of people and thought about all the versions of this moment that hadn't happened. The version where she'd turned off the trail outside Caldwell and never stopped for Nathan's wagon. The version where the leg had gone wrong faster than it did, or the blizzard had lasted longer, or Eli's fever had climbed instead of breaking. The version where she'd reached Clara's cabin alone, filed the deed alone, lived on the land alone, and called it strength because she didn't have a word for what the other thing was. She didn't believe in the tidy lesson, the clean moral that the story was supposed to end on. Life didn't produce those. It produced situations you went through and came out of changed in ways that only made sense when you looked backward. But sitting at Clara's table in the summer with the door open and the creek sound coming in, and Nathan's voice outside with the neighbors, and Eli laughing at something by the water, she understood something that she'd been circling for a long time without quite landing on. She'd come out here to save what Clara built. And she had. But what she'd been most afraid of losing, the self-sufficiency, the control, the life arranged so that nothing essential depended on anyone else. That was the thing that had never been as solid as she'd believed. It was a structure built after loss, not a foundation. The foundation was something else. The foundation was the part of you that remained when the structure came down, and it was stronger than the structure had ever been. Needing people wasn't the risk. It was the thing she'd been practicing without admitting it. In Clara's letters, in the care she'd given to other people's difficulties, in the way she'd tended Eli through the fever and held the rope in the blizzard night and made the poultice by firelight in an abandoned cabin while Nathan slept. She'd been doing it all along. She'd just been calling it something else. Clara had known this, had written it in the letter, in the jar, in that particular oblique way that sisters sometimes communicate across the whole distance of having known each other their whole lives. You might have to ask twice. I know you. She hadn't had to ask twice. That was the thing. She hadn't had to ask at all. Nathan came inside to get water and stopped when he saw her face. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true and because he'd earned the plainness of it, better than all right. He filled the cup and looked at her for a moment with that quiet reading look, and then he went back outside, and she heard him say something to the neighbors and heard them laugh. And the afternoon light came through Clara's east window at the angle it came through in summer, lower and longer than the winter light, laying itself across the floor in a shape that moved slowly as the sun moved. She put her hand flat on the table. Clara's table. Her table. The table that Eli ate breakfast at, and Nathan spread the survey maps on, and that would have homework on it someday when there was a school within riding distance, which there would be, because these things came to places where people stayed and built and refused to be moved. Outside, Eli laughed again at something by the creek. The sound of it came through the open door like weather, like the kind of weather that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need to, the kind that simply arrives and changes the quality of everything without requiring you to name what it has done. She sat with it. The frontier was not kind. She had never believed it was kind, and nothing in the past months had revised that. It was hard country that asked everything of you and gave back only what you could hold, and what you could hold depended entirely on what you brought and who stood beside you when the storms decided to come. You didn't conquer it alone. Nobody ever had, whatever they'd told themselves about it afterward. What you could do was come prepared. Keep good records. Know what you had the right to claim. Accept the rope when someone held it out to you in the dark, and hold it for someone else when the dark was theirs. And if you were very fortunate, if the trail ran the way it sometimes ran, through all the wrong weather and all the wrong circumstances, and still managed to bring you to the right place, you could find yourself at a table in the house you'd crossed the frontier to save, with a family you hadn't planned on, and a creek outside that didn't freeze hard in February, and the kind of settled quiet in your chest that you used to confuse with loneliness, but now recognized as its opposite. That was what it felt like. Evelyn Mercer Cross sat at the table her sister had built and listened to the sounds of her life, and let that be enough, because it was exactly and precisely enough. And she had learned at considerable cost that knowing when something is enough is not a small thing. It is, in fact, everything.